So to wrap up our conversation from last week on voter targeting, I did want to talk a little bit about voter groups, because the impression I'm afraid that I may have left at the end of last week, because we didn't get all the way through this conversation, is that every voter in your community is a potential vote. And they are, but that doesn't necessarily mean every single one of them is a potential messaging target. And so by prioritizing demographically, by prioritizing geographically, and most importantly, by identifying the most important interest groups in your area, whether those interest groups are focused on one of your 3 policy priorities or not, you lend yourself to a much more efficient and likely more successful form of political communication.
Are these interest groups, do they align on the same ideological spectrum as the candidate? When you're talking about prioritizing interest groups?
Well, a voter group, just like an individual voter, can be categorized as a saint, sinner, or salvageable. And so certainly those that already are predisposed to agree with you ideologically are your lowest hanging fruit. But except for those who are vociferously and directly opposed to your priorities, it's still worth talking to a group. I might not have said much about school safety, but this is a group who cares about schools that Bertrand has become a part of. They're not saints, because they're not necessarily lined up on the same issue goals, but they're salvageables. And they're more salvageable than most because they care about something, and because I can communicate with them more efficiently than I can with just the average random voter who hasn't associated with a larger group.
So you would then say prioritize people with interest groups who would fall in the salvageable category.
I would say prioritize interest groups, and thank you for bringing this up to clarify. I would say prioritize those interest groups that fall in the saint category. If their interest groups are organized around the policy priorities that you bring to your campaign, then that's the first concentric circle of support in your community. Because again, you're not necessarily persuading these people, but the first step toward mobilizing them is simply introducing yourself to them. So generally speaking, mobilizing saints is a first priority, whether it's an individual voter or voter group. The second step toward a successful campaign is persuading salvageables, either individual or by group. And then identifying the sinners and devoting somewhat less time and resources to them comes last. So again, if you identify an existing interest group that's already in line with what you believe, those are the people you want to start within your campaign, not just to get them to vote for you, but to get them, and we'll get to this in a few minutes, but to get them to help you reach out to others. Think of a campaign, and I may have mentioned this before, think of a campaign as a series of concentric circles. You are at the center of that circle. That first concentric circle around you are your friends, your coworkers, your neighbors, your family members, your people who you've worked with, people who are members of your interest group. If all you do is get those people to vote for you, you're going to lose. What we're going to talk about a little bit later today, and a lot more in weeks 4 and 5, is what else you do with your saints. And what you do essentially, in general terms, we'll talk about it more specifically, is you rely on that first concentric circle of saints to help you identify that next group, and then the next one, and then one after that. My friends are my first concentric circle. My friends' friends are my second concentric circle. My friends' friends' friends are my third concentric circle. And by friends, of course, I'm talking in verbal shorthand. Friends, ideological allies, coworkers, however you identify that first rung of support. Your primary goal with them, of course, is to get their support. Once you got them on board, you put them to work. And we'll talk a little bit later today and a lot more in weeks 4 and 5 about the various ways to do that. So persuading salvageable voter groups is important, but the first groups to start with are those people who already agree with you. They just don't know that you're there to lead them yet. I want to move on, does anyone else have any other questions about voter groups or more generally about voter targeting? Because what I want to do now then is to move on from the conversation of voter research to one on candidate research. And there are, sadly, only 2 types of candidate research. But we can pretend there were 3 if that helps in terms of understanding the import. The type of candidate research that those of you who follow politics have probably heard about and thought about and read about is opposition research. And for those of you who follow these types of things, when you think about opposition research, what you think about is hiring private detectives to follow Senator Edwards, or excuse me, you think about hiring private detectives to follow your opponent, and interns to dive into dumpsters looking for incriminating documents, and bribing hotel desk clerks and all that kind of seamy stuff that shows up on, in bad movies about politics. Well, opposition research isn't nearly that glamorous. It's not nearly that exciting. The overwhelming majority of opposition research is reading about your opponents, not their personal biography, more often than not their professional biography. The overwhelming majority of opposition research is learning about your opponent's political biography. What's in their political biography? Well, if they've held office before, you want to research the votes they've cast for and against particular legislative items. If they haven't held office before, you want to research the voting records of those people who they have worked for, those elected officials they have worked for. You want to research the candidates and the causes that they've publicly endorsed. The op-ed pieces they've written, or the commentaries they posted online. The letters of the editor that they've written to the local paper. The petitions that they've signed. Because what you want to understand more than anything else is you want to understand, bless you, you want to understand their political biography. Because understanding your opponent's political biography is the first step toward framing a comparison versus your own.
But I actually feel like, as a voter, I hear more about personal biographies, especially like what's wrong with the other candidate personally. Like I hear more about Romney's religion than I do about his voting record, or like any of his political biography. It just doesn't stick as much as like the personal stuff.
We're going to be talking about positive and negative and comparative messaging in a little bit, so if we can come back to this particular discussion. My own personal opinion, and it's one of the reasons that I am no longer actively involved in campaign politics, is I actually used to tell my opposition researchers not to research my opponent's personal biography, not because I thought it was morally wrong. Okay, maybe that was a little part of it, but I knew I didn't have the self-control. Attacking, as we'll talk about earlier, attacking an opponent's personal biography causes a much greater level of backlash than criticizing them on policy. And I simply didn't trust myself. I didn't think I had the self-discipline to avoid that kind of thing. And I'd suggest to you, and we'll talk about this more later today, that ultimately Romney's religion or Barack Obama's religious associations are going to swing very few votes in this election. That primarily has more to do with motivating saints than it does persuading salvageables. Ultimately, if you remember I said this a week ago, ultimately campaigns are decided on the issues. Biography is the threshold that gets voters to the point where they're willing to consider you as a candidate. Once they're willing to consider you credibly as a candidate, it's issues that decide the election. And ultimately, it's your candidates and your opponents' political biography and issue history. They're going to be the most relevant research to do. But let's come back to this when we get to positive and negative messaging, okay? Stop licking your chops. The negative campaigning conversation is fun, but it's not that fun, okay? Opposition research is important, but what's far more important is self-research. Research on your own candidate, or odd and awkward as it sounds, research on yourself. Why would you have to research your own candidate? Why would you have to research yourself? Well, people have imperfect memories. People tend to look at their own past through rose-colored glasses. It's human nature to embellish a little bit, not because you're malicious, not because you're actively trying to mislead people, but it's human nature to make a story sound a little bit better than it actually was. And then a little bit better than that. And then a little bit better than that. In 2008, Hillary Rodham Clinton was running for the Democratic nomination for president. And she talked about a trip that she took to Bosnia as First Lady. And she talked about dodging sniper fire when she disembarked from her aircraft. Well, as it happened, the Obama campaign identified footage of First Lady Hillary Clinton arriving in Bosnia. Not only was there no sniper fire, there were smiling children presenting her with flowers. Something out of Oz. It was sort of sweet. And Hillary Clinton's not a bad person. And whether she knew there was a video of that or not, she wasn't trying to intentionally mislead someone. But you tell a story and it gets a little bit better and it gets a little bit better and a little bit better. Did I ever tell you guys about the time that I made the basket for my high school that won the Wisconsin Interscholastic High School Basketball Championship? No. Well, there's good reason for that. It wasn't a state championship. It was an intramural game. And it wasn't the basket to win the game. We were down by 20, and my captain finally decided it was worth putting me in. But I didn't make the basket. That was pretty neat. But you tell that story a few times, and it gets a little bit better, and a little bit better, and a little bit better. And soon, again, not because of any malice or any effort to mislead, you just make your own past look a little bit better than it was. And particularly, when it comes to political biography, when it comes to policy matters, and there's a written record, well, you want to, if you're a candidate, either look back at yourself or better yet, get a staffer or a friend or a volunteer who's willing to put in the time to look back. And by the way, when I talk about votes, and I talk about speeches, and I talk about op-eds, let me be very clear about this. I'm also talking about Facebook postings. I'm talking about Twitter feeds. I'm sure you've heard this from people other than me, but when you apply for a post-TFA job, what do they tell you to do? To clean up your Facebook feed, right? Because there were a few Saturday nights, okay, maybe more than a few, not my most judge, that you don't necessarily want a prospective employer looking at. I will tell you this, and I will not mention either the name or the campaign, but a student of mine here at USC, just graduated a few weeks ago, was offered a job on one of the presidential campaigns, on one of the two major party nominees. She'd been active in her college political organization. She'd volunteered on past campaigns. Her first job out of college was going to be, albeit as if you're a junior level staffer, but working for a major party's nominee for president. Well, the campaign did a check on her. And they found some Twitter feeds. And none of them reflected any illegal activity, but they reflected some insensitivities. And my guess is, knowing this young woman from her time here at USC, she meant them as jokes. She wasn't necessarily malicious toward the people or toward the voter groups or the communities that she was referring to. She was having some fun with friends. But it was part of her public record. And the campaign called her and said, listen, we're very sorry, but we can't have you involved in our effort. We're sorry. Her personal biography included a couple of very innocent Twitter feeds, and now she's not working for a presidential campaign. Self-research. And by the way, even if I stay away from personal biographical research on my opponent, I want to do it on my own candidate. And if you're running for an office that does not have the resources to hire someone to do it, then find someone you trust, a good friend, someone who's going to volunteer for your campaign, a close friend, and you can say to him or her, more important than canvassing, more important than helping me raise money, more important than taking me to an interest group, I need you to help me research me. Because if you miss something in your opponent's biography, all you're missing is an opportunity to point out a contrast, an inconsistency, a weakness. If you miss something in your own biography, you're leaving yourself wide open. And that's the kind of thing the candidates don't necessarily recover from.